The boy had done it again. Sable Marin knelt on the schoolroom floor, surrounded by the aftermath of a 6-year-old's tantrum. Ink splattered across 3 separate workbooks, a chair overturned, a pot of crushed violets smashed against the stone wall, the flowers she had picked that morning to brighten the windowsill now a ruined streak of purple against gray. Caius stood in the corner, his small chest heaving, his dark silver eyes wide and furious, and brimming with tears he refused to let fall. "I will not write it," he said through clenched teeth. "I will not." Sable sat back on her heels and looked at him. Not with anger. Not with the thin patience she had seen so many tutors wear like a mask before they snapped. She just looked at him, the way she always did, like he was not a problem to be solved, but a person worth understanding. "All right," she said quietly. "Tell me why." The fury in his face flickered, confused by the lack of punishment. He blinked. His lower lip trembled once before he caught it between his teeth. "Because," he said, his voice cracking, "the composition is about family, and I do not have one." The words landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. Sable felt the ache settle behind her ribs, the one that never fully left, the one she carried like a second heartbeat. She knew that wound. She had been living inside it for 6 years. "You have me," she said softly. "For what that is worth." Caius stared at her. Then he crossed the room in 4 quick steps and pressed his face into her shoulder, his small hands fisting in the fabric of her dress. She wrapped her arms around him and held on, breathing in the cedar and wild mint scent that clung to him, the scent that reminded her every single day of the man she had run from. Because Caius smelled exactly like his father, and his father was the Alpha King. The door opened without warning. Sable looked up, expecting the housekeeper, expecting a servant come to collect the laundry, expecting anyone other than the man who stood in the doorway. Cale Rendrick, Alpha King of the Northern Sovereignty, filled the frame like a wall of black leather and barely restrained violence. He was taller than she remembered, broader, harder. The years had carved away whatever softness had remained in him and left behind something forged in loss and fury. His dark hair was longer, swept back from a face that looked like it had forgotten how to do anything other than command or destroy. His gray eyes, the same impossible silver gray that stared up at her from his son's face every morning, locked onto Sable. Then they dropped to the boy in her arms. Then back to her. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. She watched it happen, watched the color drain from his face, watched his hands clench into fists at his sides, watched his chest stop moving because he had simply forgotten to breathe. Half a decade, searching, hunting, tearing his kingdom apart trying to find her. Unanswered questions and a hollow place in his chest where a bond had been ripped out at the root. And here she was, holding his son. "Sable," he said, and her name came out wrecked, shattered, like he had been saying it into empty rooms for years and had stopped believing anyone would ever answer. Caius pulled away from her shoulder and turned to look at the stranger in the doorway. The boy frowned, studying the man's face the way children do, openly and without mercy. "Who are you?" Caius asked. The king could not speak. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at Sable with an expression so raw and devastated it made her stomach drop. She tightened her arms around the boy and met the king's gaze with a steadiness she did not feel. "Caius," she said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper, "this is the king." "I know who the king is," Caius replied impatiently. "Why is he staring at me like that?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sable had ever heard. Because the answer to that question would change everything, and she had spent 5 years making sure no one ever asked it. 6 years earlier, Sable Marin had never been inside the Great Hall of Ashenmore Keep. She had never had reason to be. Omegas of no bloodline and no family name did not attend royal gatherings. They worked in the kitchens, the storerooms, the herb gardens at the edge of the palace grounds where no one of importance ever ventured. That was where Sable belonged, and she had made peace with it the way one makes peace with weather. It simply was. But tonight, the choosing feast demanded every unmated Omega in the territory be present. It was tradition, older than the keep itself. On the night an Alpha King declared his intended mate, every eligible Omega stood witness, not because any of them might be chosen. The choice was always political, always prearranged. The Omegas stood because tradition required bodies. Sable stood near the back wall between a laundress named Orla and a seamstress whose name she had not caught. The great hall blazed with firelight and the combined scent of 300 wolves pressed into a space built for maybe 200. Her head swam with it. Too many pheromones, too much alpha posturing, too much noise. She focused on the flagstones beneath her feet and tried to breathe through her mouth. The king entered, and the hall went silent. Cale Rendrick did not walk into rooms. He overtook them. The sheer force of his presence compressed the air until Sable's lungs felt too small. He moved through the crowd without touching anyone, but people parted for him like water around a stone, instinctive and immediate. She did not look up. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor and counted the cracks in the stone. The ceremony was mercifully brief. The court announcer read the terms of the alliance. Lady Vedra Ashworth of the Eastern Province would become the Alpha King's mate. The union would strengthen the border territories and bring an end to 3 generations of territorial dispute. It was sensible, strategic, bloodless in the way political marriages always were. Sable felt nothing about it. Why would she? The king was a distant figure, a name spoken in hallways, a shadow that passed through the palace above while she lived in the world below. His choice of mate had the same relevance to her life as the migration patterns of birds. The announcer finished. The court applauded. Lady Vedra, sleek and immaculate in midnight silk, inclined her head with the practiced grace of someone who had been rehearsing this moment her entire life. And then the king turned. He turned away from his intended, away from the court, away from the carefully orchestrated pageantry of the evening, and looked directly at Sable. She felt it before she understood it. A pull behind her sternum, sharp and sudden, like a hook had been set somewhere beneath her ribs, and someone had yanked the line taut. Her breath stuttered. Her vision narrowed. The noise of the hall became a dull roar, and all she could see was him standing 40 feet away, staring at her with an expression of absolute shock. No one had ever looked at her like that. Like she was the only solid thing in a room full of ghosts. The moment lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he looked away, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists at his sides, and the ceremony continued as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. Sable could still feel it, the invisible thread stretched between them, humming with a frequency that made her teeth ache. She pressed her hand flat against her chest and willed her heartbeat to slow down. It did not. The feast that followed was a blur of noise and heat. Sable could not eat. The pull in her chest grew worse with every passing minute, a constant low-grade ache that sharpened every time she accidentally glanced toward the high table where the king sat beside his intended. He was not looking at her. He was very deliberately, very carefully, not looking at her. And somehow, that was worse. Orla nudged her elbow. "You all right? You look pale." "Fine," Sable managed. "Just the heat." She excused herself before the 3rd course and fled into the corridor. The cool air hit her like a mercy. She leaned against the wall, pressed her palms flat against the cold stone, and breathed. The pull eased slightly with distance but did not disappear. It lodged beneath her ribs like a splinter, small and sharp and impossible to ignore. She knew what it was. Every wolf knew. A mate bond, incomplete, unsolicited, and catastrophically inconvenient. The Alpha King, on the night of his official betrothal to a noblewoman, had locked onto an Omega with no name, no family, and no future. Sable stood in the dark corridor and did the only thing that made sense. She decided to pretend it had not happened. She would go back to her herb garden. She would keep her head down. The king would marry Lady Vedra, produce heirs, and rule his kingdom, and whatever phantom connection his wolf had misfired across a crowded room would dissolve on its own. That was the plan. She was still telling herself this when a voice came from behind her. You felt it too. Sable spun around. The king stood at the end of the corridor, half swallowed by shadow. He had left his own feast, left his own betrothal celebration, to follow her. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Your Majesty, I do not know what you mean. Yes, you do. He took a step closer, then stopped himself, like he was fighting the same pull she was. What is your name? She should not answer. Every instinct screamed at her to bow and leave and never speak of this again. But his eyes held hers, and the connection hummed between them, and her mouth opened before her brain could intervene. Sable, she said. Sable Marin. He repeated it silently, his lips shaping the syllables like he was memorizing them. Then he closed his eyes, and she watched something that looked remarkably like pain cross his face. This cannot happen, he said, more to himself than to her. I know, Sable whispered. They stood in the dark corridor, 10 feet apart. The bond stretched between them like a wire about to snap, and Sable understood with perfect clarity that her life had just split in two. Everything before this moment, and everything after. And the everything after terrified her. 3 days passed. Sable returned to her garden. She pruned the rosemary, watered the feverfew, catalogued the dried stores of chamomile and calendula, and did not think about the king. She was very successful at not thinking about him, except when she was breathing, or awake, or existing in any capacity whatsoever. The pull hummed beneath her sternum like a low, constant note, inescapable. She could feel the direction of him the way a compass feels north. When he was in the east wing, the pull tugged east. When he moved to the council chamber, it shifted. She hated it. She hated how aware of him she had become without ever seeing him, without exchanging another word. On the morning of the 4th day, a page appeared at her garden gate. The king requests a consultation with the palace herbalist regarding a private medicinal matter, the boy recited, his face carefully blank. Sable's hands stilled on the lavender she was tying into bundles. I am not the palace herbalist. I am an assistant to the palace herbalist. Master Orin is occupied, the page said. The request falls to you. Of course it did. She cleaned her hands, smoothed her hair, and followed the page through the palace corridors. He led her not to the infirmary, but to the king's private study. The door was open. Kale sat behind a desk piled with correspondence, his head bent over a document, a pen in his hand. He did not look up when she entered. You sent for an herbalist, Your Majesty, Sable said from the doorway, her voice flat and professional. I did. He still did not look up. I require a sleeping draught. Master Orin can prepare one. I will relay the request. I asked for you? The words hung in the air. Sable's fingers curled into her palms. Your Majesty, she said carefully, this is not appropriate. He finally looked up. The shadows beneath his eyes were deeper than they had been at the feast, and the set of his jaw suggested he had not slept at all in the days since. The sight of it sent a sharp, unwanted pang through her. I am aware of what is and is not appropriate, he said, his tone clipped. I have slept a combined 4 hours in 3 days. My wolf is... He paused, searching for the word, agitated. Every remedy Master Orin has provided has failed. You are an herbalist. I am asking for help. He was not asking for help. He was engineering proximity, and they both knew it. And the infuriating part was that Sable could feel her wolf responding. The restlessness that had been building for days eased slightly just being in the same room as him. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steadied. The hum in her chest settled into something almost warm. She clenched her jaw and stepped inside. What has Master Oren given you so far? Valerian root, passion flower tincture, some vile concoction involving skullcap that tasted like swamp water. And none of it worked? I would not be sitting here looking like this if it had, he said dryly. Sable bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. She moved to the side table where a tray of unused remedies sat in neat glass bottles and began examining them. Standard preparations. Well mixed. Properly dosed. There was nothing wrong with any of them. These are all correctly prepared, she said. If they are not working, the issue is not herbal. Then what is it? She turned to face him and immediately regretted it, because he was watching her with that same unguarded intensity from the feast, like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. Her pulse kicked up hard. You know what it is, she said quietly. His jaw tightened. I am marrying Lady Vedra in 12 days. I am aware. This bond, he stopped, started again. I did not choose this. Neither did I. Neither of them spoke. The air was loaded with everything they were unwilling to say. She could feel the pull intensifying, tightening like it was trying to close the distance between them by force. She set the bottle down and moved toward the door. I will prepare a stronger blend. Valerian combined with hops and lemon balm. I will have it sent up within the hour. Sable. She stopped but did not turn around. It helps, he said. Being in the same room, the wolf quiets. She closed her eyes. I know, she whispered. It does the same for me. She left before either of them could say anything they could not take back. The draft she prepared was excellent. It would not work, and she knew it, because the insomnia was not chemical. But she made it anyway, and told herself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Over the following week, the consultations became a pattern. Every morning, a page arrived with a different excuse. A headache remedy, an unfamiliar herb, a minor training injury, and every morning, Sable went. She told herself it was duty, that the 20 minutes she spent in his study each morning meant nothing. But each visit lasted a little longer than the last, and each time, the conversation drifted further from medicine. But each visit lasted a little longer than the last, and each time the conversation drifted further from medicine. You have no family? He asked one morning, not looking up from the document he was pretending to read. No, I was raised in the communal wards, aged out at 16. And you chose herbalism? It chose me. I liked growing things, making things heal. He was quiet for a moment. I think that might be the most earnest thing anyone has ever said to me. She snorted before she could stop herself, and his gaze snapped to her, something startled and warm flickering in his eyes. Like he had not expected her to make that sound. Like it delighted him. Sable looked away quickly, her face heating. I should go. Master Oren will wonder where I am. Of course. He paused. Same time tomorrow? Your Majesty, you do not need daily herbal consultations. My headaches are persistent. You do not have headaches? The corner of his mouth twitched. It was not a smile. It was something too careful, too restrained to be called a smile. But it lived in the same territory. Same time tomorrow, he repeated, and it was not a question. Sable left his study with her heart in her throat. The wedding was in 5 days. Lady Vedra's entourage had already arrived. The entire palace was being transformed for a celebration that Sable knew was built on an incomplete foundation. Because the king's wolf had already chosen, and it had not chosen Lady Vedra. That night, lying in her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, Sable made a decision. She pressed her hand against the ache beneath her ribs, the connection pulsing beneath her palm like a second heartbeat. And she made the only choice that would save them both from disaster. She would leave, before the wedding, before the bond deepened further, before she ruined a political alliance and destroyed a woman who had done nothing wrong and upended a kingdom because her wolf had decided to want something it could never have. She would disappear, and the king would marry his intended, and no one would ever know. She packed a single bag in the dark and left before dawn, slipping through the service gate while the night watch changed shifts. She did not look back. If she had, she might have seen the candlelight still burning in the king's study window, and she might have understood that he had not slept at all that night, and she might have heard the sound that tore from his chest at dawn when the invisible thread between them stretched taut across the distance, and he realized, with the shattering clarity of a man who had just lost something he had barely begun to understand, that she was gone. 5 years later. The village of Brindell sat in a valley so deep and so far from the northern sovereignty's capital that most maps forgot to include it. That was precisely why Sable had chosen it. She had arrived pregnant, terrified, and alone, with 16 coins and a knowledge of plants that turned out to be worth more than currency in a place where the nearest proper healer lived 2 days' ride away. Within a month she was treating coughs. Within a year, she was delivering babies. Within 3 years, the village had given her a cottage at the edge of the birchwood with a garden large enough to grow everything she needed, and a door that locked from the inside. Caius had been born in that cottage on the coldest night of the year, screaming so loudly that her neighbor Marin came running with a blanket and a knife, convinced someone was being murdered. "Just a baby," Sable had panted, holding the red-faced, furious newborn against her chest. "That is not just a baby," Marin had said, staring at the infant's silver-gray eyes. "That is a whole storm in a blanket." She had not been wrong. Caius was, by every measurable standard, difficult. Sharp, stubborn, fiercely intelligent, and possessed of a temper that could strip paint. He had his father's coloring, his father's eyes, his father's unsettling ability to hold a stare until the other person looked away first. At 3, he refused to wear shoes unless he had personally approved of them. At 5, he operated with the absolute certainty that he knew better than everyone around him. He also had, buried beneath all that fury and armor, a loneliness so vast it took Sable's breath away. Because Caius had no pack, no father, no family beyond Sable. Sable had done everything she could. She had built him a world in Brindell, a school run from the village hall where she taught him alongside the other children, a routine of lessons and chores and evenings reading by the fire. She had given him stability, safety, love. But she could not give him what he actually needed, which was the truth. "Why do I not have a father?" he had asked for the first time at age 4. "Some children do not," Sable had said, which was true and also completely inadequate. "Thomas has a father. Bryn has a father. Even Lirael has a father, and hers lives in another village entirely. Your situation is different." "How?" "It is complicated." "Uncomplicate it." She had managed to redirect him that time, and the next, and the next. But the questions were growing sharper as he grew older, and the evasions were growing thinner, and Sable knew with the cold certainty of someone watching a levee crack that the truth was coming whether she was ready or not. The bond had never faded. That was the thing she had not anticipated. Every text, every piece of folk wisdom said the same thing. Incomplete bonds weakened with distance. They frayed. They became echoes and then nothing. Hers had not. 5 years and 400 miles away, she could still feel him. A low pulse beneath her ribs, steady as a tide. Some nights she let herself wonder whether he had searched. whether the ache ran both ways. She always shut it down before the wondering became dangerous. The morning the world ended started like every other morning. Sable woke at dawn, dressed in the dark, checked on Caillou sleeping in his small bed with one arm flung over the edge and his mouth open, and went to start the fire. She brewed tea, set porridge on the stove, and reviewed her lesson plans for the day. Reading comprehension for the older children, arithmetic for the younger ones, and a nature lesson that involved collecting bark samples from the birch wood. Caius woke grumpy, as he always did, and ate his porridge in hostile silence, as he always did, and complained about the walk to the village hall, as he always did, and Sable loved him so fiercely it physically hurt. They arrived at the schoolroom early. Sable arranged the desks, set out the workbooks, sharpened the pencils. The other children filtered in, 7 of them ranging in age from 5 to 11, and the morning proceeded without incident. Until the composition assignment. Write about your family, Sable instructed, because the curriculum guide she had borrowed from the regional lending library said family narratives built empathy and language skills. She had not thought it through. The realization hit her a half-second after the words left her mouth, and by then it was too late because Caius was already staring at her with those silver eyes, and she could see the storm gathering. The tantrum that followed was spectacular even by his standards. The ink, the chair, the flowers, the absolute refusal to engage with the assignment. The other children watched with the resigned familiarity of people who had seen this particular show before. Sable sent them to collect bark samples early and stayed behind to deal with the aftermath. She was kneeling on the floor, cleaning ink from the floorboards, when Caius finally cracked, "Because the composition is about family, and I do not have one." And Sable held him, and smelled his father in his hair, and felt the bond pulse beneath her ribs, and wondered for the 1,000th time if she had made the right choice. That was when the door opened, and half a decade of running ended in a single heartbeat. Cale Rendrick stood in the doorway, and the connection detonated. Not a hum, not a pulse, an explosion, white-hot and all-consuming, flooding through her body and stealing every molecule of air from the room. She could see it hit him at the same instant, watched his body jolt, watched his pupils blow wide, watched years of control shatter across his face, in the space between one breath and the next. He looked at her. He looked at the boy in her arms. He looked at the boy's eyes. "Sable," he said, and her name sounded like a wound being reopened. And behind her, Caius looked up at the king and asked, "Who are you?" The silence swallowed everything. Sable held her son and stared at the man she had run from and felt the ground beneath her begin to give way, because the king was not alone. Behind him in the corridor she could see the black uniforms of the royal guard, and beside him, stone-faced and watchful, stood a woman she did not recognize, tall with sharp features and cold blue eyes, and a possessive hand resting on the king's arm. The woman looked at Sable, looked at Caius, looked at the king's shattered expression, and her cold blue eyes went absolutely glacial. "Cale," the woman said, her voice like a blade wrapped in silk. "Who is this?" The king did not answer. He could not stop staring at Caius, at the boy's silver eyes, his dark hair, the jawline that was already sharpening into something unmistakable. Sable's arms tightened around her son. The woman in the corridor took a single step forward. "I asked you a question," she said. "Who is she, and why does that child look exactly like you?" The woman's name was Thessaly Voss. Sable learned this in the minutes that followed. Thessaly was the king's chief political advisor, a high-ranking alpha from one of the old families, and the woman who had managed the search for Sable for the last 3 years. She was not the king's mate. She was not his lover. But the possessive hand on his arm and the fury in her cold blue eyes told a story that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with a woman who had positioned herself exactly where she wanted to be and had just watched the ground shift beneath her feet. "The child is yours," Thessaly said to Chaol, not as a question. The king had not moved from the doorway. His eyes had not left Caius. The boy had returned to Sable's side and was watching the adults with the wary alertness of a young wolf assessing a threat. "Yes," Chaol said. His voice was rough, barely controlled. "The child is mine." Caius looked up at Sable. "What does he mean?" Sable's throat closed. She had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in her mind, had planned careful words and gentle explanations, had imagined sitting Caius down by the fire in their cottage, with warm milk and time and privacy. Not this. Not a stone schoolroom with ink still drying on the floor, and a king in the doorway, and a woman with glacier eyes measuring the distance between them. "Caius," she began. "He is lying," Caius said flatly. "He is not my father. I do not have a father. You said so." "I said it was complicated." "And I said uncomplicate it." His pale gray eyes, so impossibly like the man standing 10 feet away, burned with betrayal. "Is he my father?" No one spoke. Sable looked at Chaol. The king looked at his son. And Caius, 6 years old and sharper than any blade in the room, read the answer in both their faces before either of them spoke. He stepped away from Sable. The movement was small, just a single step backward, but it carved something open inside her. "You lied to me," he said quietly. "I was trying to protect you," Sable whispered. "From what?" Caius demanded, his voice rising. "From having a father? Everyone else gets to have one, and you just decided I could not?" He turned to Chaol with a fury that was almost impressive in its purity. "And you? Where were you? If I am yours, why did you not come?" "I did not know," Chaol said, and his voice broke on the last word. "I did not know you existed." The boy stared at him for a long, terrible moment. Then he turned and ran. He shoved past the guards in the corridor, past Thessaly, past all of them, and disappeared into the village with the speed and instinct of a wolf pup who had spent his whole life running through these woods. "Caius!" Sable cried, lunging after him. Chaol caught her arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to stop her. "Let my guards find him. These woods are unfamiliar to me, and my men are trained trackers." "They are unfamiliar to you, but they are his home," Sable shot back, pulling free. "He knows every tree, every creek, every hollow log. Your trackers will not find him until he wants to be found." She met his eyes, and the pull between them roared, a deafening cacophony of pain and longing and years of silence crashing together. "I know where he goes when he is upset. Let me bring him back." Chaol held her gaze. She watched the struggle in his face, the warring impulses of a king who commanded armies, and a father who had just met his son for 60 seconds before the boy ran from him. "You will come back," he said. It was not a question, but it was not entirely a command either. Somewhere beneath the authority, she heard something fragile, something afraid. "I will come back," she said. She found Caius where she knew she would, curled in the gap between the roots of the great birch at the edge of the wood, the one that formed a natural shelter just large enough for a small boy to disappear inside. His knees were drawn to his chest, his face buried in his arms. He was not crying. He was past crying, in the place beyond tears where the hurt was too large for something as small as weeping. Sable crawled in beside him and sat in the dirt and the roots and the smell of damp bark, and did not say anything for a very long time. Finally, Caius spoke. "Did you leave because of me?" The question hit her like a blow to the sternum. "What? You ran away from the king before I was born. Was it because you were carrying me? Were you ashamed?" "No," Sable said, and the word came out fierce and broken. No, Caius. Never. Not for 1 second. Then why? She pulled him against her, and he resisted for a moment before his body gave in, and he pressed into her side, small and rigid and shaking. Because I was afraid, she said. Because the king was promised to someone else, and I had no name and no family, and I thought if I stayed, I would ruin everything. For him. For the kingdom. For the woman he was meant to marry. She swallowed hard. I thought I was doing the right thing. Were you? Sable closed her eyes and felt the bond pulse in her chest, stronger now than it had been in all the years apart, so strong it made her teeth ache. I do not know, she admitted. I thought so at the time, but I think I might have been wrong. Caius was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he looked sad. Who? The king. He stumbled over the word, father. He looked sad when I ran. Sable's throat tightened. Yes. He did. Another silence. Then, very quietly, will you take me back? They walked back to the village together, Caius's hand in hers, and found Cale standing alone outside the schoolroom. He had sent the guards away. Thessaly was nowhere in sight. He stood with his arms at his sides and his face carefully composed, but Sable could see the tension in his jaw, could feel the desperate restraint through the bond. Caius stopped 6 feet from the king and studied him with those unnerving gray eyes. I am angry with both of you, he announced, but I have questions, and I expect answers. All of them. Starting now. The corner of Cale's mouth trembled. Not a smile. Something closer to awe. He lowered himself to one knee so he was level with the boy's gaze. Ask me anything, the king said. The answers took hours. They sat in Sable's cottage, the three of them, around the small wooden table where she and Caius had eaten every meal for 5 years. The king looked absurdly large in the space, his shoulders too broad for the chair, his head nearly brushing the drying herbs that hung from the low ceiling. He held a cup of tea that Sable had made out of sheer nervous habit, and he answered every question Caius threw at him with the careful patience of a man who understood that this was the most important negotiation of his life. Why did you not marry my mother? She left before I could find her, before I knew about you. Did you marry someone else? No. A pause. The alliance was restructured. Lady Vedra married my cousin instead. The political arrangement was preserved. Sable's head snapped up. She had not known that. For 5 years she had imagined him married, mated, a queen beside him in the great hall, while the bond she carried became an increasingly inconvenient ghost. Learning that he had dismantled his own betrothal, that he had found another way, made something inside her constrict painfully. Caius continued his interrogation, methodical and relentless in a way that would have been terrifying from an adult and was somehow even more so from a 6-year-old. Why did it take 5 years to find us? Your mother is very clever, Cale said, and his gaze flickered briefly to Sable. She chose a village too small for any census, used no family name that could be traced, and avoided every trade route my searchers monitored. How did you find us now? A merchant from the eastern valleys mentioned a healer in Brindell, who used techniques he had only ever seen practiced at Ashenmore Keep. My advisor followed the lead. Thessaly, Sable thought. Of course. The woman who had managed the search for 3 years had been the one to finally succeed, and the irony of that was sharp enough to draw blood. Night fell. Caius, despite his fierce insistence that he was not tired and had at least 40 more questions, fell asleep on the narrow bench beside the fire with his head on a cushion and his shoes still on. Sable covered him with a blanket and stood there for a moment, watching the firelight move across his face. When she turned, Cale was watching her. The cottage was too small for the two of them. Every breath she took was saturated with his scent, cedar and iron and something darker beneath it. And the connection between them was a living thing now, pulling and pulling and pulling. "You should have told me," he said quietly, not angry, devastated. "About him, about the pregnancy." "And what would you have done?" Sable asked. "Broken a political alliance that preserved peace across 3 territories?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. The word landed between them like a detonation. "You do not mean that." "I have spent every one of those years meaning it," he said, his voice low and rough. "Do you know what that was like? Waking every morning with the bond screaming inside my chest and not knowing if you were alive or dead?" He took a breath that shuddered visibly. "I tore my kingdom apart looking for you. Ask Thessaly, who has spent 3 years watching me destroy myself over a woman I knew for 12 days. 12 days. That was all they had shared. 12 days of pretending to discuss herbs while the pull between them built like a storm, and then she had vanished, and he had been left holding an invisible thread attached to nothing. "I was protecting you," Sable whispered. "You were protecting yourself," he corrected, and the gentleness in his voice made it worse. "You decided you were not enough, and you made that choice for both of us." The truth struck her so hard her vision blurred. He was right. Beneath the careful reasoning and the selfless narrative was the same wound she had carried her entire life: the communal wards, the unclaimed child, the girl nobody wanted. She had run because she believed she was not worth staying for. "Kale," she started, but her voice failed. He crossed the small room in 2 steps and stopped directly in front of her. Close enough to touch. Close enough that the pull became a physical vibration between their ribs. "I am not here to punish you," he said. "I am not here to take the boy from you. I am here because I am tired, Sable. I am so tired of missing you." She broke. The tears came without permission, silent and overwhelming, and she pressed her hands over her face because she could not bear for him to see it. This total collapse of every wall she had built to survive the years alone. His arms came around her, slowly, carefully, giving her time to pull away. She did not pull away. She pressed her face into his chest and let the tension between them settle like a held breath finally released. They stood like that in the dim cottage while the fire crackled and their son slept on the bench, and Sable felt something she had not felt since the night she fled Ashenmoor. Safe. But safety, she knew, was not the same as simple. And the complications arrived with the dawn. Thessaly was waiting outside the cottage at dawn, flanked by guards. "The council has been informed of the heir's existence," she said to Kyle. "The boy must be brought to Ashenmoor for verification. Lord Halvard has been positioning his nephew as your successor for 2 years. If the boy is not presented before the Autumn Council, he will argue illegitimacy." Kale's jaw tightened. "The boy is not a political asset, Thessaly. He is a child." "Time is a luxury your rivals will not grant you," Thessaly replied. "We will return to Ashenmoor," Kale said. "All of us." His gaze found Sable as he said it, and in his eyes she saw the question he would not ask in front of Thessaly. "Will you come? Will you stay this time?" Sable looked at Caius, who had appeared in the doorway of the cottage in bare feet and rumpled clothes, his eyes moving between the adults with the watchful intelligence of a boy who understood more than anyone gave him credit for. "Are we leaving?" he asked. "Yes," Sable said. "We are going to the capital." "To the palace?" "Yes." Caius considered this for a moment. Then he looked at Kale. "Will I have my own room?" he asked. Something cracked in Kale's composure. A fracture so brief most people would have missed it, but Sable saw it. The flash of raw, agonized tenderness that crossed his face before he locked it down. "You will have your own room," the king said. "Then fine," Caius said, and went back inside to put on his shoes. Ashenmoor Keep sat on a plateau of black stone, its towers rising against the sky like teeth. Caius pressed his face to the carriage window and breathed. "It is enormous." "It is," Sable agreed, feeling dread where she should have felt awe. The last time she had been inside those walls, she had been invisible. Now she was returning as the mother of the king's heir. The corridors she had once navigated as a servant now felt vast and watchful. Courtiers stared. Servants whispered. Caius walked through all of it with his chin raised and his silver eyes daring anyone to comment. They were given chambers in the royal wing. Caius immediately claimed the largest bedroom, declared the bed acceptable, and began opening every drawer and cabinet with the systematic thoroughness of an invading army. Within the hour, a woman appeared at the door, Mistress Pembry, head of the medicinal arts, middle-aged with kind eyes and calloused hands. She offered herself as an ally with a directness that took Sable's breath away. "The court will eat you alive if you let it," Pembry said. "Do not let it." The formal verification happened 3 days later. Sable dressed Caius in the new clothes that had appeared in his wardrobe, dark wool and polished boots that he complained about bitterly, and walked him to the council chamber with her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her skull. The chamber was full. 30 members of the King's Council sat in tiered rows of carved stone seats, their faces arranged in expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Lord Halvard, a broad-shouldered alpha with a red beard and calculating eyes, sat in the front row with his arms crossed and his mouth set in a hard line. Thessaly stood near the king's chair, composed and watchful. Cale sat on the elevated seat at the head of the chamber, and when Sable entered with Caius, his eyes found hers immediately. The pull surged. She gripped Caius's hand tighter. The verification was a formality in practice, and an ordeal in reality. A healer confirmed the blood match. A scribe recorded the physical markers, the distinctive eyes, the bone structure, the early signs of alpha characteristics that were already manifesting in the boy's dominant temperament. One by one, the council members examined the evidence and rendered their assessment. Lord Halvard was the last to speak. "The blood is confirmed," he said, "but legitimacy requires more than biology. The boy was born outside a sanctioned bond. The mother is an omega of no lineage who fled the capital under cover of darkness." He leaned forward. "I invoke the right of contested lineage." The chamber erupted. Voices overlapped, some in outrage, some in agreement, all of them too loud and too sharp for a room containing a 6-year-old boy who had done nothing wrong. Caius's hand tightened in Sable's. She looked down and saw fear in his face for the first time since she had known him. Real fear. The kind that came from understanding, even at 6, that you were standing in a room full of people deciding whether you mattered. Something inside Sable caught fire. She stepped forward, pulling Caius gently behind her, and the movement silenced the chamber. Not because she had authority, not because she had rank, but because she moved with the quiet, focused certainty of a woman who had just run out of room to retreat. "My son's blood has been verified," she said, her voice steady and clear in a room that expected her to tremble. "His father is your king. That is not a political question. It is a biological fact." Halvard opened his mouth. Sable did not let him speak. "I understand the law requires a recognized bond," she continued. "I understand the succession demands legitimacy beyond blood. But my son is standing in this chamber, Lord Halvard. He is 6 years old. He can hear every word you are saying. And if you believe for one moment that I will allow his worth to be debated like a trade agreement while he stands here watching, then you have fundamentally misread the situation." The hush that followed was immense. Cale rose slowly from his seat. Every eye in the chamber shifted to him. He descended the steps from the raised platform and crossed the floor, his boots echoing in the hush. He stopped beside Sable and Caius. Then he knelt. Not to the council. Not to the law. He knelt in front of his son, the way he had in Brindell, and placed one hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is my heir," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "Any challenge to his claim is a challenge to me." Lord Halvard's face went rigid. The chamber held its breath, and Caius, small and fierce and shaking, looked up at his father with those silver eyes and did something no one expected. He put his hand over the king's. The gesture was tiny, a child's hand covering a man's, but the connection between father and son was visible in it, undeniable, and the chamber saw it, and something shifted in the air, something that even Halvard's political machinery could not grind away. The session was adjourned without a ruling. Halvard left without speaking. That night, after Caius had been put to bed, Sable stood on the balcony of the royal wing. Chaol found her there. They stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the darkened city. "Halvard will not stop," Sable said. "No," Chaol agreed. "He will not." "What happens if the council rules against Caius?" Chaol was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his face was stripped of every mask he wore for the court, for the council, for the kingdom. What remained was the man she had known for 12 days 6 years ago, tired, honest, aching. "There is one way to end the challenge permanently," he said, "one legal precedent that Halvard cannot contest." Sable's heart began to race. She already knew what he was going to say. "A completed mate bond," Chaol said quietly, "between you and me, recognized before the court, sealed before witnesses. It would legitimize Caius beyond any challenge. The heir of a bonded king and queen is untouchable by succession law." The air between them became very thin. "You are asking me to bond with you," Sable said, her voice barely above a whisper, "to save our son." "I am asking you to bond with me because I have wanted nothing else for 5 years," he said, his gray eyes burning in the dark. "Caius is the reason it needs to happen now, but he is not the reason I am asking." Sable felt the connection flare between them, brilliant and aching, and knew with absolute certainty that if she said yes, there would be no more running, no more hiding, no more pretending the girl from the communal wards did not deserve a place beside a king, and if she said no, Halvard would destroy them. She opened her mouth to answer, and from inside the chambers, Caius screamed. The sound was piercing, a high, keening cry that shattered the silence and sent ice flooding through Sable's veins. She was through the balcony doors before conscious thought caught up with instinct. Chaol half a step behind her, both of them sprinting down the corridor toward the boy's room. They burst through the door and found Caius sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide and glowing, not silver but gold, the brilliant, unmistakable gold of a wolf in the first stages of an involuntary shift. His small body was rigid, shaking, his hands gripping the sheet so tightly the fabric had torn. "Something is wrong with me," he gasped. "Something is inside me and it wants out." Chaol froze. Sable grabbed Caius and pulled him against her chest. The boy was burning with fever, his skin radiating heat, and beneath her palms she could feel the ripple of muscle and bone trying to reshape itself. He was shifting. At 6 years old, 3 years before any normal wolf child should be capable of it. "Get Pembry," Sable commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Now." Chaol was already moving, shouting for the guards, his composure broken by a terror Sable had never seen on his face before. And in her arms, Caius screamed again, his small body convulsing, the gold in his eyes blazing brighter, and Sable held on with everything she had and whispered into his hair, "I am here. I am here. I am not letting go." Pembry arrived within minutes, barefoot and still tying her robe. "How long?" Pembry asked, already kneeling beside the bed where Sable held Caius against her. "Minutes," Sable managed. His eyes changed first, then the fever, then the convulsions. Pembry pressed her hand to the boy's forehead. "His temperature is dangerous. An early shift is rare, but not unheard of. What is unheard of is this level of distress. The wolf should emerge gradually. This is, she paused, violent. Caius whimpered against Sable's chest. His fingers dug into her arms hard enough to bruise, and she held him tighter, pouring every ounce of calm she could summon into her voice, into her scent, into the steady rhythm of her breathing against his. "Look at me," Sable whispered. "Caius, look at me." His golden eyes found hers, wild with terror. "Your wolf is not something wrong with you," she said. "It is part of you. It has always been part of you. It is just waking up, and it is scared because you are scared." "I cannot stop it," he gasped. "You do not have to stop it. You just have to let it come." Pembry administered a cooling tincture and a muscle relaxant while Sable held the boy steady. The convulsions eased slightly but did not stop. The gold in his eyes pulsed, brightening and dimming like a heartbeat. Cale stood in the corner, motionless, his face ashen. Sable could feel his panic, a roaring static of helplessness that he was fighting to contain. "Talk to him," Sable said, looking at Kyle. The king blinked. "What?" "He needs to hear your voice. You are his father. You are an alpha. Your wolf can calm his." She held his gaze. "Please." Cale crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate, like the floor might give way beneath him. He lowered himself onto the edge of the bed and placed his hand on Caius's back. The boy flinched, then stilled. "I do not know what to say," Cale admitted, his voice stripped bare of every pretense. "Tell him something true," Sable said. Cale was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned closer to his son, and when he spoke, his voice was low and rough, and barely steady. "When I was 9 years old, my wolf came early too," he said. "Not as early as yours, but early enough that no one expected it. I was in the training yard, and the shift hit me so hard I knocked over a weapons rack and scared the stable horses half to death." He paused. "My father found me curled behind the grain stores, shaking, convinced I was broken. He sat down beside me in the straw and said, 'The wolf does not come to destroy you. It comes because you are strong enough to carry it.'" Caius's breathing hitched. His golden eyes, still blazing, shifted to focus on Cale's face. "I did not believe him at first," Cale continued, his hand steady on the boy's back. "It took me a long time to understand what he meant. But he was right. The wolf chose you because you are strong enough, Caius. Stronger than you know." The boy's trembling slowed. Not stopped, but eased, like a tide pulling back from the shore. The gold in his eyes softened, flickered, and then, gradually, began to recede. Silver crept back in from the edges, reclaiming the irises inch by inch. Caius exhaled, a shuddering release that seemed to empty his entire body, and collapsed against Sable's chest. His skin was still hot, still damp with fever sweat, but the convulsions had stopped. His wolf had retreated, not gone, but settled, resting just beneath the surface like an animal that had finally been acknowledged. Pembry sat back on her heels. "The crisis has passed," she said quietly. "But this will happen again. His wolf is too powerful for his age. The shifts will come in waves until his body is mature enough to sustain the transformation fully." "How do we manage it?" Sable asked. "Pack stability," Pembry said, her gaze moving between Sable and Cale with pointed deliberateness. "A young wolf's ability to regulate their shift is directly connected to the strength of their pack. The stronger the family around them, the safer the transitions." She let the implication settle. Conversely, an unstable pack, fractured connections, unresolved tensions between parents, those make the shifts more dangerous, potentially lethal. The weight of her words pressed down on the room like a stone slab. Sable looked at Cale. He looked back at her. And between them, the pull hummed with an urgency that was no longer about politics or succession or the machinations of Lord Halvard. This was about their son, about keeping him alive. "We cannot wait," Sable said. "No," Cale agreed. "We cannot." The bonding ceremony happened at dawn. Not in the Great Hall, not before the court. It happened in the palace chapel, a small stone room with arched windows that caught the first light and scattered it across the floor in fragments of pale gold. Pembry stood as witness. Corvin, the palace steward, stood as officiant. Caius sat on the front bench in wrinkled nightclothes with his shoes on the wrong feet, watching with solemn intensity. Sable wore a dress borrowed from Pembry that was slightly too large in the shoulders. Her hair was loose, still tangled from the night. She had not slept. Her hands trembled. She had never felt more certain of anything in her life. Cale stood before her in the pale light, and the mask was gone. All of it. The king, the commander, the alpha, the political strategist. All of it stripped away. What remained was a man looking at the woman he had spent half a decade searching for, and the expression on his face was so open, so unguarded, so achingly tender that Sable's vision blurred. "I should have come back," she whispered. "I should never have run." "You are here now," he said. "That is enough. That has always been enough." The bond words were ancient, older than the keep, older than the sovereignty. They spoke them together, their voices tangling in the quiet chapel, and when Cale pressed his lips to the curve of her neck, gentle and reverent, the incomplete thread that had stretched between them for 6 years finally closed. The sensation was indescribable. Warmth flooded through her, not just physical but structural, like a foundation finally settling into the ground it was meant to stand on. She could feel him. Not just his presence, but his heart, his fears, his overwhelming love for the boy sitting on the bench behind them. She marked him in return, pressing her own claim against his skin, and felt his arms tighten around her, felt his whole body shudder with the force of something he had been carrying for years finally being released. From the bench, Caius's voice broke the silence. "Does this mean I can call him father now?" he asked. Cale pulled back from Sable, his eyes wet, and turned to look at his son. He could not speak. He just nodded. "Good," Caius said, matter-of-factly. "Father, your shoes are untied." Sable laughed. The sound came out broken and wet and utterly joyful, and Cale laughed too. A rough, cracked sound, and Caius looked between them with the baffled tolerance of a child surrounded by adults who had clearly lost their minds. The cord adjusted. Slowly, grudgingly, and with considerably more gossip than Sable would have preferred. But it adjusted. Halvard's challenge collapsed within weeks. Thessaly remained, and a grudging respect settled between her and Sable. It was enough. Caius's shifts continued in unpredictable waves, but Pembry had been right. With the pack bond stabilized, each one was easier than the last. Cale sat with the boy through every single one, telling stories about his own childhood, about the wolves in their line who had carried impossible gifts and survived them. On the night of Caius's 7th birthday, the boy completed his first full shift. He stood in the palace courtyard under a sky bright with stars, a small, dark wolf with silver eyes, and howled. Cale shifted beside him, enormous and black and unmistakable, and answered. Sable watched from the steps, tears streaming down her face. She had been an unclaimed child once, a nobody Omega, a woman who had run because she believed she was not worth the space she occupied. She had been wrong. One evening, months later, Sable found Caius in his study. He was writing. Not grudgingly, not under protest, but with focus, his dark head bent over the page, his pen moving steadily. "What are you working on?" "The composition," Caius said without looking up. "Which one?" "The one about family." Sable's breath caught. She crossed the room and looked over his shoulder. "My name is Caius Rendrick," The composition began. My mother is a healer who can grow anything. My father is the king, and he is very tall, and sometimes forgets to tie his shoes. I did not always have both of them. For a while, I had only my mother, and that was enough because she made it enough. But now I have a father too, and a palace, and a wolf inside me that is learning to be still. I have a family. It is not perfect, but it is mine. Sable pressed her hand over her mouth and could not speak. Caius glanced up at her, frowning. Is it bad? She shook her head, tears spilling over. It is perfect, she managed. You are crying, he observed. Yes. Is that because it is good, or because something is wrong? Because it is good, Caius. He considered this. Adults are very confusing, he concluded, and returned to his writing. That night, Sable lay beside Cale in the quiet dark of their chambers. His arm was around her waist, his breath warm against her hair. He finished the composition, she said softly. The family one? Yes. Cale pulled her closer, pressed his lips to her temple, and said, Good. Outside, the wind moved through the birch trees that Sable had planted along the palace wall. Seedlings carried all the way from Brindell because some things deserved to be brought along rather than left behind. They were still small, still growing, still finding their roots in unfamiliar soil. But they were growing, and that was enough.